Sanitation. Linnell has also served as an elected official committeewoman in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. She's held roles as a community health supervisor, an urban gardener, and a clinical herbalist. So I want to thank Miss Linnell Fall for joining us. Next up, we have Dr. Kevin Slayton. Dr. Slayton works with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, and he also serves as an adjunct professor with the Lancaster Theological Seminary in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He's held leadership positions in the Public Justice Center, Associated Black Charities, and the Baltimore City delegation to the General Assembly. He's also the proud author of a newly released book titled Politically Preaching, and is senior pastor of the Northwood Appald United Methodist Church in Baltimore. So thank you, Dr. Slayton, for joining us today. Next up, I want to introduce President Courtney Jenkins of the Metropolitan Baltimore AFL-CIO. So Courtney began his working life at the U.S. Postal Service as a mail processing clerk. He spent over 10 years in service to Local 181 of the American Postal Workers Union. He later represented thousands of public and private sector workers at AFSCME Council 67. Today, like I said, he's the president of the Metropolitan Baltimore AFL-CIO, where he now leads the region's coalition of labor unions, including mine, to organize for a future where workers are empowered and receive their fair share. Finally, joining us today is Stuart Katzenberg. Stuart spent a decade at Acorn in Maryland, D.C., and Ohio, where he organized childcare associations, campaigns against banks, landlords, and took on the lead paint industry. Today, Stuart is the director of collective bargaining and growth strategies at AFSCME Council 3, which is the largest and fastest growing union for state and university workers in Maryland. At Council 3, Stuart is focused on winning new organizing campaigns, stopping the hiring of contractual workers at higher ed institutions, and winning legislative victories to stop at-will employment for salaried employees. Now, I'm just going to reiterate really quickly about our process. I'm going to have a series of questions for our panelists. Lots of them are going to address some of the things I saw in the chat earlier. We're asking that for those of you in the audience who have questions, please type them into the chat after this part of the program is complete. Given our time limits, we're going to try and take 2 or 3 of them. Please follow the guidelines, make it a question, not a statement or opinion or commentary. And we're asking you to send these questions directly to Rachel, who will consolidate the themes. So with that, I am going to start our questions, and I've batched them into sort of larger topics. And our first questions are going to be on the topic of labor and wealth inequality. And my first question is directed to Stuart Katzenberg. So Stuart, your union, AFSCME, was responsible for organizing the sanitation workers in Memphis in '68. And now you are the director of collective bargaining for AFSCME Maryland Council 3. This has been a terrible year for the Department of Public Works employees in Baltimore City, where 2 workers, Ronald Silver II and Timothy Cartwell, died on the job. Can you speak to the current conditions for sanitation workers in Baltimore? What progress has been made for workers since 1968? And where does progress still need to be made?
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you everyone for being here on this important weekend. I'm honored to be on this panel. Look, we've made enormous strides since '68. Our union, led the organizing drive for sanitation workers in Memphis and then across the country in Baltimore too, where it was segregated. And we represent those same workers here in the city. It has been a terrible year. We lost 2 of our union brothers to preventable accidents. And I guess it just shows that there's always more work to be done. And, unionization is the first step so that you have rights and representation. The second step, which is always important, is then holding power accountable. And power may be the private company, but power may also be the government. And in this case, we've taken proactive steps to ensure significantly more investment into our facilities in Baltimore City to protect our members. But we've taken it a step further. This legislative session, AFSCME is introducing what we're calling the Davis-Martinez Public Employee Safety and Health Act, HB 176 and SB Senate Bill 26, named for another union brother who was murdered on the job this past year in Montgomery County, Davis Martinez. It will give state authorities for the first time the ability to enforce health and safety violations for public employees, create a division within MOSH, the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to work on public employees, whether you're in Baltimore County, whether you're in Baltimore City, whether you work for the state or a university, or all the way out in Garrett County. Workers will finally have an ability to get inspections and mechanisms to fine and hold government accountable when people aren't being safe. We're also pushing at the bargaining table, and we're going into contract negotiations with Baltimore City for over 2,500 city workers, mostly blue collar workers this year.
Thank you, Stuart, for that answer. And for folks who are listening in, when we talk about some campaign work that is ongoing, I promise you there'll be other opportunities to get more information. Okay, I'm going to direct my next question to President Courtney Jenkins. So, President Jenkins, as director of the Metropolitan Baltimore AFL-CIO, you have a unique understanding of the labor landscape in our region. Now, I can't help but see the film we just watched and feel inspired by what feels like robust labor power. 1,300 sanitation workers walking off the job, mass meetings, mass arrests. It's sometimes hard to imagine this level of unity and power in the modern day labor movement. So, my question is, can you speak to the state of the modern labor movement? What's changed? How are the conditions then different from now? But what can we do to get there again?
And thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the panelists and everyone watching on Zoom. It's an honor to be here. I'm glad to be my good brother from Ask Me Stu. It's always good to see you, brother. Brother Slayton, Sister Claudia, Sister Fall. Always a pleasure. First I want to just pause and say, watching that movie and knowing about that story, there's a great weight that I feel as a labor council president, as a Black trade unions member, as a card carrying member of AFSCME. There are so many intersections that just came from sitting and kind of unpacking those things, and knowing that there's a legacy that I must protect. And even the Memphis Labor Council was involved in that story that we just watched, right? So the AFL-CIO has always been there to support our individual affiliates in their respective and collective efforts, and that still happens today, right? We've seen it even more so recently with the SEIU reaffiliate at the national level. So turning our, maybe 13 million members across the country into 15 to 16 million members. So there's power in that unity and solidarity. I'd say, since 1968 and the decades after, there have been some great things that happened in labor, but of course, some things that have been, challenges and issues for us. So some of the great things that have happened is we've become much more inclusive and diverse within our ranks. As you see, those brave men in Memphis were fighting for union recognition, but there was also a racial dynamic to that, right? And not to say from an athlete, but just from the labor movement as a whole, where we've had challenges, right? And we were able to overcome those challenges. But in today's times, you have a lot more younger membership, a lot more diverse when it comes to racial background and all other identifiers, right? Even myself, again, I kind of check some of those boxes as being a young person. I guess still a young person, if you call it that.
You are.
A Black man, of course, a card carrying union member, right? So those efforts to be more inclusive and diverse have been a principle of the AFL-CIO, especially in recent times. I was able to sit on the Labor Commission for Racial and Economic Justice, and on the heels of the death of Michael Brown back in 2016. One of the things that the AFL-CIO recognized was that Michael Brown's mother was a member of an affiliated union, right? And so those issues all intersected, and the labor movement was saying, we need to be at the forefront of these conversations. But even still in those great moments of growth, we call it, we've seen a decline in union membership density across the nation. At our height, we were almost 30% of the working population. And in today's time, I think, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're about 10 to 11% of the working population. And of course, that is not by happenstance or coincidence. There have been forces working against working people for the last few decades. And as we can see, there's a direct correlation between union membership and density and economic inequality, right? So if you could look at a line graph as union membership declines, economic inequality grows, right? And we know corporations, political parties, politicians, everything in between have been, intentional about busting up workers. And I think what we saw through Dr. King's last campaign was there was so much power in being able to bring people together across different identifying lines. And I think there are certain powers that be that recognize that and will do anything to try to continue to divide to conquer. So in these times, what we're also seeing now on the heels of COVID is an increase in organizing. And Brother Stewart, Sister Claudia, you all know Baltimore has become somewhat an epicenter of that organizing. Our sisters and brothers that asked me have been going into spaces and places once thought out of the reach of organized labor, our cultural centers like our museums and libraries. We have our sisters and brothers at the Machinist who organized the first Apple store in the nation, right? That was a big feat going up against a almost $3-4 trillion company, right? So, a lot of things are happening here on the ground. But again, as my good brother Stewart said, there's still much more to be done. And as I stood next to my brother Stewart at that press conference where we called out the city of Baltimore to be more accountable to workers, this conversation we're having now, everything kind of came full circle. Because again, there's a saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But there are many fights ahead for labor as we enter into a uncertain time. But I know, across our coalition, whether it's labor, faith communities, civil rights organizations, all like-minded groups, we'll get through this.
Thank you, President Jenkins, and you gave me a great segue because my next question is actually for Dr. Slayton, thinking about these coalitions. So, Dr. Slayton, in the film, we saw Reverend Lawson, and we saw many faith leaders support the fight for the rights of sanitation workers. So I'm going to ask you, what role did faith leaders play in the civil rights campaign, and what role do faith leaders play now in advancing social justice more broadly?
Well, one, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you. The movie, even though I've seen it a couple times now, it never ceased to move me. Faith leaders, particularly because of the success of Dr. King, in particular doing the Montgomery bus boycott, sort of positioned the church, the Black church in particular, a very strong position to influence movement. I think number one, it was a central place that people could gather. So it was ideal for organizing and mobilizing. But two, there was also a message that emanated from the pulpit that was not only encouraging, but one that suggested that people had a responsibility in bending that moral arc. Justice was not going to just be handed, but we had something to do. And so naturally, you gathered information. You were encouraged by your brothers and sisters who were in the struggle. And there was a place that people could be inspired, that what they were doing was bigger than them. The faith community sort of said, this is the embodiment of that scripture that makes us think that we are created in God's image, that we are walking along the same path as Jesus, in that we are being persecuted, that we are carrying this unnecessary burden, but there's a requirement that we can stand and that we can fight, and that it's something that we must do. And I often say that it is because King led so well, he was the blueprint, that there is still this expectation that hangs over the church, particularly the Protestant African American, what we would call the Black church, to show up in times of strife and struggle, in local communities in particular, to sort of carry that mantle and lift that. And I think that is what concerns me today, is as we've moved through particularly the mid-1990s and the introduction of charitable choice language, which helps to sort of unblur the lines of what we all come to know as separation of church and state. particularly the African American church in urban communities, that prophetic voice, if you will, has been diluted because charitable choice sort of comes along and creates them as a faith-based institution, but now opens the door to blur the line so that faith-based institutions that traditionally did that type of on-the-ground organizing, mobilizing work no longer do it, because in many ways the type of work and outreach that they would do has been professionalized. I give the example of, which is from a book entitled Faith in Action, where he gives the example of, 35, 40 years ago, Church A is across the street from the Johnson family, and Mrs. Johnson dies, leaving Mr. Johnson with 5, 6 children. Well, Church A went over without any necessary permissions, but they showed up to do the outreach and the healing for the Johnson family, food, what have you, da da da. Charitable Choice comes along and says that now Church A really might want to be careful how it engages the Johnson family because it's not professionalized. You're not qualified to do that type of work. And B, the church down the street is provided a grant to do the type of work that you're trying to do. And I argue, particularly in my book, that is one of the things that has neutered the voice and the advocacy of the traditional African American church. Those churches that we witnessed and those faith leaders in this movie, they were committed to the cause. Their loyalties were not divided. They had not sort of given in to the idea that they could leverage their prophetic pulpits in order to engage in a way that might allow them to benefit in some other way. And so that's what concerns me to this day. But the power that was there, again, because King was so effective at it, I don't think it has gone away yet. And I'm hoping that there's a resurgence in that prophetic voice, particularly in cities like Baltimore.
Dr. Slayton, thank you for this observation. And, if we were able to convene in person at Baltimore Hebrew, we would have had copies of your book out at a table. I would appreciate it if someone could drop the full title and information about the book in the chat, because I think that clearly, this is something to think about, this dilution of power and in doing this work, this movement work, and it's really interesting to hear about it. There's similar parallels in the labor movement. There's conversations about, have we become service unions or organizing unions, and what are the things that drove us in there? So I'm going to stop talking. I thank you for that response, and I'm going to direct the last question in this batch to Miss Linnell Fall. So, Ms. Fall, Dr. King utilized the sanitation workers' strike to lift up the crisis of poverty and the working poor in America. Now, unfortunately, we know that wealth inequality has only worsened since 1968. Why are we seeing such a crisis of poverty and inequality in the US, in a place that prides itself on freedom and liberty and is undoubtedly the wealthiest country in human history?
Well, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this important day and honoring Dr. King. I grew up in a church in Philadelphia, Ebenezer Seventh-day Adventist Church, where I had direct contact with one individual who was connected to Dr. Andrew Young, who asked Dr. King to come to the Memphis, Tennessee sanitation workers march and to support them because they were going through so much after these 2 men were tragically murdered in a trash truck that was with a malfunctioning components to it. And his speech and the way he talked, his name was Mr. Brother Epps, and his wife was one of the presidents of Spelman University. So they were just dynamic people, and I learned so much from him. But Dr. King's involvement brought national attention to the issues of economic injustice and civil rights, emphasizing the connection between labor rights and the broader civil rights movement. His support helped to galvanize public opinion and provided a significant boost to the workers' cause. And that is what the Poor People's Campaign does. We are a national call for a moral revival, and that is with every ethnicity. We bring everyone's issues because poverty has no color, poverty has no race. Poverty is everywhere in this United States and in the state of Maryland, with 1.1 million poor and low-income people. In the 1967, this country was going through protests and marches and riots in cities. Lyndon Baines Johnson set up the Kerner Commission. Now, this Kerner Commission spent 6 months doing research, visiting the slums, the supported ghettos, and they came up with this document. And this document, Jesse Jackson said, was a civil rights leader, said that this was the last attempt to address honestly the structural inequalities that plague the African American communities. We have poverty is a moral failure in our society, and it can be eliminated. We need to deconstruct, dismantle, and expose the myth of about race and class to reconstruct our American democracy. Poverty is a policy choice reflecting low wage and high cost of living. In this country today, we have the second highest rate of poverty among 339 OECD countries. We need to abolish poverty. The federal minimum wage in the United States of America is still $7.25 an hour since July of 2009. January 1st, 2025, 34 states and territories and districts have a minimum wage higher, have increased their minimum wage higher than $7.25 an hour. 3 states, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, have a minimum wage lower than $7.25 an hour. Also, in these states, the federal minimum wage of $7.25 generally applies, but tipped laborers are still making $2.13 an hour. This is serious. There's a serious economic injustice that is taking place in the United States of America. We see so much violence due to the disinvestment all across America. In this state alone, 17,000 people have left since 2024 because of poverty and the underfunded for housing, healthcare, jobs. These issues are still a problem today. Since in 1968 are still a problem today. We have made strides. African Americans still, unfortunately, with housing, 74% of other races own their homes, and only 44% of African Americans own their homes. These disparities unfortunately, in this particular study, are designed by, I'm sorry, excuse me. They are designed by white Americans. What white Americans have not fully understood, but what this is a quote, the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply impacted in the ghetto. White institutions created it and maintained it, and they condone it. And this is a serious issue in our society, and it dominates it. And so we have to mobilize, organize, and rally and create policies to benefit the people who are struggling for their very existence to survive in this country. And it is unbearable. We have 800 people per day who die because poverty is the fourth leading cause of death in the United States. We have the highest infant mortality rate. We have a serious issue in the United States and a serious morality and greed. We have 11 billionaires in the state of Maryland. All it takes is $177 million, per year to end poverty. $177 billion. It's not a lot, not in this country. We can end poverty in the United States of America. We demand to end poverty and abolish poverty in the United States of America. The Poor People's Campaign has an end of policy resolution, and we have asked everyone to sign this bill. It is in Congress at this time. And I will go on with my next question. I think I've gone over my time.
No, it's fine. Your next question was actually, and I will get to it in a second, was going to be discussing in more detail those components of reconstructing our democracy. But so actually, it's a great segue because I want us to discuss Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign in a little more detail. So I'm going to start with President Jenkins for a second. At the onset of Dr. King's journey, his work focused around racial justice and equality. And while that obviously continued throughout his life, there was a pivot. And that pivot included economic justice, inequity in his work and campaigns. Can you speak more to why that shift occurred?
No, absolutely. And that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think the quote was kind of mentioned earlier, and I will paraphrase it a little bit, but Dr. King realized that what good is it to sit at an integrated lunch counter if I can't afford to eat at that counter? So it's one thing to be able to vote. It's one thing to be economically empowered to, have the time to even do such. Because even in today's times, if you're a working person, it's much harder to do that, right? But I believe that Dr. King, again, quickly realized the true path to liberation depended on us having a just economy, right? Where everyone could prosper. And, even in his addresses to the AFL-CIO, he shared with them that the labor movement and the civil rights movement, our goals are completely aligned. Well, that's to make sure that people have democracy, whether it's in the workplace or in their communities, better wages, benefits, and things like, and working conditions and things like that. I believe he quote, and I'm going to quote this correctly. Dr. King said, "The duality of interest of labor and Negroes makes any crisis which lacerates you as a crisis from which we bleed." And there's a common saying that, when the country catches a cold, the Black community catches a flu, right? So issues of economic inequality are just exacerbated in those spaces when we talk about the intersections of race and work, right? And I think he, again, quickly realized that the only way to bring a massive movement of people together was along a clear through line that we all could agree on and we all were affected by, and that was poverty. Again, whether you're a white working class individual or a Black working class individual, the key term there is working class. right? And we are all experiencing the same types of inertias working against us. We just have to kind of see the forest for the trees, right? I think that's what he was trying to get the broader labor movement to see, and which is why we believe that, well, I believe that his last days were because of this campaign. I think that those powers that be again saw the power where you could bring together a massive amount of people, regardless of where they were from, who they were, you know, what they believe in, how they identified. Everyone can agree that, look, the price of eggs is too high, right? No matter who you are. Well, unless you're the wealthy 1%, right? If you're a working class or middle class individual, there were some through lines there that we could all kind of recognize and come together around. And I believe that that was just the next step. You know, it was kind of like, you know, you escalate. All good organizers know the tactics of escalation, right? And it was, okay, first let's get our foot in the door with ensuring these unalienable rights that they talked about in the Constitution were offered to all of us. And then the next thing to do was to make sure that pursuit of happiness, we really focused on that. And the pursuit of happiness, unfortunately, in a capitalistic society, has a lot to do with the economy. But, you know, recognizing that our humanity is so tied to our work, right? Whether it's perceived by others or internalized. How we view our worth a lot is tied to what we do when we hit that clock or we open that laptop up, right? And you know, I had all these eloquent answers for you, Claudia. But I will say, you know, I'm taking the story from my own family, right? We all are familiar with the story of the Great Migration. And, you know, diving into that, and I talked to Sister Rachel, actually, I've dived into more genealogy. I just want to know where I come from.
Yeah.
But I learned that they put my great grandmother on a train from South Carolina to Baltimore for economic opportunity, right? And she married a gentleman who worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And he actually used to lead non-denominational prayer sessions at work for worker safety, right? And then learning that my grandfather worked for the post office department and then went on to work for the Department of Labor and enforce compliance when it came to federal contractors and their ability to hire people of color and, you know, minorities. And knowing that my grandfather, through that work, again, work is at the center of it, he was able to find out about this great experiment happening in Howard County with the Rouse family and was one of the first Black families to move to Columbia, Maryland. And how, again, that was a middle class lifestyle through his work, right? And afford the opportunity for my father to go to college and then for me to be able to do the things I do today, right? So again, there's that through line, and it's always been work,
Right.
especially for the Black community. So I think Dr. King just had the foresight to see that, and, you know, maybe not see it to the end because that's what that speech was. He said, "I may not get there with you," and oh, how heavy is that? But he knew we would get there eventually. Right. So, you know, and I think that's, again, to answer your question, I think Dr. King just had the foresight to see that that next frontier would be the frontier to make sure economic inequity was, you know, squashed in all corners of where it may be.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. I actually, Ms. Fall, I want to go back to you for a second. So, as the Tri-Chair of the Maryland Poor People's Campaign, the national call for moral revival, I was taking some notes on some of your words about how we need to deconstruct and demolish these current systems and reconstruct democracy. Can you speak to how the modern campaign is working to take up Reverend Dr. King's call for economic justice 50 years later? Those components, you started talking about some of them and sort of like the specific work that needs to be done.
Yes, our emphasis is a campaign to address the 5 interlocking injustices, which is systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of healthcare, militarism and the war economy, and the false moral narrative of evangelical nationalism. The Poor People's Campaign was launched and revised by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. I have to speak about them because they're powerful leaders, and they began with a wave of nonviolent and civil disobedience. And most of the training came from Dr. Lawson. Dr. Lawson trains all of us to be nonviolent. That is That is he is the key to the movements in this country. And the Poor People's Campaign, we get our information from national, and we go within our regional states, regional states, and then we launch an action. The Poor People's Campaign had a 42-week this year, a 42-week campaign to bring about awareness of voting rights, voting action, and voting mobilization, and ending poverty in the United States of America. The Poor People's Campaign of Maryland, we launched, we started with our movement. We held national press conferences on February the 12th, February the 5th, February the 12th. We had pep rally across the nation. Each state had a pep rally. February the 20th, we had simultaneous conferences with our state and local delegates and both parties in the House and the Senate. We went in there, we had our demands and our expectations and what needed to be done in our states. And that was a national action. We had thousands on March the 2nd of last year. We had thousands of poor and low income people and advocates go to their state capitals and speak about the injustices that are taking place and to wake the sleeping giants, which are 15 million poor and low wage voters in America, and 22% of them are in the state of Maryland who rarely vote and are registered, but for some reason they don't vote. We had other press conferences in our local regions in Baltimore and PG County and Moco County. But in Baltimore, we had a press rally in Emerson Village. They have 55 years of not having a 55 years they've had a grocery store, and then a year ago, their grocery store left. Now they are about to get 2 grocery stores. So we know when we come out, when we speak about the disparities and the issues that are taking place, action takes place, because we have a phenomenal, and I mean, the Poor People's Campaign has a phenomenal policy committee. Our policy committee, headed by Miss Susan Allen, Don Pellis, Joanne Wooten, and Initial Galloway, our policy director leaders, are phenomenal. After the March 2nd march, we went back to Annapolis to address our legislators again. We went in February. We had a huge rally in Annapolis, in Thurgood Marshall Row. We marched around. We counted each death of a person who dies every day from poverty. We have a powerful phone banking headed by Abigail Conrad and Rachel Buck, I'm sorry. And we had a David Motz, who is our labor leader, and everyone and everything else. We also have a coordinating committee, and we come together once a month to talk about the issues or the things that we have done throughout our communities and what we need the whole group to rally around and to get done in a mass number. We also have a robust social media network headed up by Mr. Mike Puskar, who is also a tri-chair. And we have had all types of campaigns, online campaigns, and it's constant. There's constant movement all around and all work. We have working groups. We have over 50 partnerships, and we work together and collectively getting Dr. King's dream, keeping Dr. King's message alive and functioning, because we can never stop fighting for justice. We must stand up against injustice, because without us speaking out, they don't think we have a voice. They don't think we have a problem. So speaking out is a powerful message, and causing, dissent. I'm not going to accept this. This is unacceptable. I mean, we have so many faith-based leaders. We have so many individuals from all walks of life, all walks of just life. It's just amazing the type of powerful work that the Poor People's Campaign is doing in Maryland and across. We have 34 committees across the United States of America, and they are working to end poverty, to lift from the bottom.
Yep.
And to make these legislators accountable for their poverty policies. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to actually have the opportunity. You just gave me another great segue for a future question for everyone on the panel. I want to pivot very briefly. And I noticed there were questions in the chat around the Jewish call for social justice. I saw some activity in the chat around these questions. So I do have a question for Stuart. Jews have a long history of work in the labor movement. Jerry Worf was featured in the film, the president of AFSCME for nearly 20 years, the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. I have to shout out Leon Davis, the founder of My Union 1199, who is a Jewish drugstore clerk in New York City. Can you speak to what about Jewish history, values, and teachings draws Jews to the labor movement and to taking social action more broadly?
Yes, speaking on behalf of all Jews. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, our both scriptures speak to, fighting for and representing the poor, whether it's Isaiah or Psalms or Proverbs. You read the Mishnah, you read the writings of Maimonides or Rabbi Hillel. They all speak to this. So it is in our faith tradition. It is also in our, right now, for most Jews, our historical experience. Many of our families came to this country with little or nothing. Many families expelled from Babylon to wherever had little or nothing on their backs. The Passover story of escaping with just sort of unleavened bread on our backs as we fled Egypt. That is our history of being poor in a lot of places. And so we commingled with other groups and fought against poverty, fought for rights for all people. I think, our synagogue, Baltimore Hebrew, my rabbi for my bar mitzvah is Rabbi Saltzman, who taught me so much about the civil rights movement. Obviously, Rabbi Lieberman, as Rabbi Bush said before then, as my father came up, learned under Rabbi Lieberman some. So at BHC, we have that tradition, and many Jews do in America. And I think those are things we've learned. And I think whether it's to be in the labor movement and also, sort of intersectionally around race and class, these are lessons we need to relearn and rededicate ourselves to. And unfortunately, we, in my opinion, have people in our community who either have unlearned or have chosen a different path, that they've said, I'd rather put my lot in with people who are racist, who don't want workers to have a voice, who do exploit division for a profit, whether that be Jared Kushner or whether that be someone who might own a local grocery store who is saying, no, I don't want workers to have a voice. I'm going to run an anti-union campaign. And it's up to everyone on this Zoom. It's up to our community to look deep inside ourselves around what's fair, what's just, and what's right. And to recognize that we are part of a larger movement of working people and of people who fundamentally want and believe that folks should be treated fairly and want rights. As Jews, if we want that for ourselves, we should want that for others, and we can't pick and choose.
Cosign, brother. For my last question, kind of on this topic, I want to turn to Dr. Slayton. So when we think about Jews in the civil rights movement, a lot of us think about the role of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who walked hand in hand with Dr. King and Selma. What do you think made their relationship so special? And how would you envision today's Jewish faith leaders best engaging in this movement for economic justice? I will note I saw quite a few Jewish faith leaders participating when I looked at our participants' numbers.
I would begin by recommending James McBride's book last year, Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. And I recommend it because it's beautifully written, but it shows a relationship that has existed post Reconstruction in this nation between Jewish and Black communities, and it's just beautifully told. It just sort of lays out how our communities, we sort of relied on each other. There was a dependence, and when the African American community was in need, historically speaking, which I will get to your question directly, the Jewish community, your fingerprints are all over it. Whether it's the founding of the NAACP, there are Jewish fingerprints on there. SNCC, SCLC, all of these organizations that were out there doing a lot of this grassroots advocacy during the civil rights movement. Jewish community was right there. Not to mention the amount, which I don't know, I'm sure someone has tracked it, the amount of legal resources that the Jewish community provided during the civil rights movement. It's probably, I dare say, immeasurable maybe. The number of Jews that marched and walked along at the grassroots level throughout different civil rights campaigns literally gave their lives. It's just documented. And so when you consider and I use this word intentionally, the imagery of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King, it's hard to look away from it because you don't see a lot of written things about the things that they engaged in, but you do have these iconic visuals of them walking together. And I think that's what is important there. I often tell my students and my members at my church that it's good to critique some of Scripture, and I like doing it. And every now and then I find places where it's really appropriate. And one of the places is the statement in Scripture that says, how can two walk together unless they agree? Well, I don't think they have to agree to walk together. I think the Heschel-King relationship shows the power of presence, and the idea that you see your fellow human being, brother or sister, as equals. That's how they were able to walk together. I think they genuinely understood, as King would say, it's not where my enemies stand in times, of chaos. It's those people who were closest to me, because what impacts one person directly affects the other indirectly. He recognized we were in this thing together. And I think that's what makes life beautiful, is when we find folks who we don't have to have the same religion, same background, same group, but we believe the same thing about one another, that we want them to have that same thing. And I'm fortunate enough on this journey in ministry and, advocacy, that one of my favorite persons to commune with and talk with is Rabbi Daniel Berg at Beth Am. That's if I can say it, that's my dude. He and I and Imam El-Amin, we can all come together and sort of walk with each other, at least stand with one another in difficult situations. And I think that's the beauty of the Heschel-King journey, is that it is captured in these visual moments where that's really what's important. He was there. He was with him. And I think that's the lesson that we take moving forward, whether it's on issues related to public policy in Annapolis, local issues here in the Baltimore area or in Baltimore County. it's important, particularly for faith leaders, that they don't stand alone, that others are there with them, even if they're not testifying, even if they're not carrying a sign, just that they are with them there in support. And I think that is the beauty of that relationship.
Thank you so much for that response. I want to be mindful of all of our time, and I know that there were folks in the audience who have questions. I would love for folks to pose some of those questions in the chat to Rachel, and I'm hoping that we can get to a few of them right now. So I'm just going to take a moment and while I'm waiting to see sort of what we think we can answer in the next few minutes, I do know that there are probably going to be questions about what the specific next steps are, right? We have we have our marching orders. We've seen it in the film from Dr. King. We see where we have to go. With that, I think I have a question very specifically on that. Where do we go from here? And can each one of you, as briefly as possible, sort of speak about like what are the concrete next steps that you envision that we can all like support one another in as we move forward in this work to seeing Dr. King's vision through. How about I just blindly choose someone to start with? I'll call on Stuart first.
Thanks, Claudia. Look, I think there's a multitude of ways that people can be active and support. I think an easy thing to do is connect with any of the groups on the Zoom, Fair Share, AFL-CIO, the For People's Campaign, and AFSCME around active campaigns and how you can support for AFSCME. I think there's 3 easy things. One, support the Davis-Martinez Act, which drop in the chat and call or email your delegate or senator and say you support it and it needs to pass this session. 2, you need to also call your delegate and senator and demand that the Senate and the House pass a robust budget in excess of what Governor Moore's proposed for fair share and taxation, so that out-of-state corporations and people with inordinate amounts of wealth pay their fair share, so we can fund robust state and local services, because a huge part of state government's funds actually come down to local government, both in education, transportation, and services. And then 3, if you can lend your voice to local campaigns here in Baltimore City, for which there's a multitude, and I know others will speak to some of them, but AFSCME has a big contract campaign coming for city workers as well as cultural workers at the Walters and Pratt, Walters Art Gallery, Pratt Library, where we're trying to get union contracts at the Pratt and Walters for the first time, and management is fighting us tooth and nail. And at the city level, where we're trying to add health and safety and fair wages for municipal employees. So anything you can do to help for those 3 campaigns would be much appreciated. Thank you all.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to next kick that same question to Ms. Fall.
Okay. We have to address wage increases to ensure fair compensation, job security, to protect workers from arbitrary layoffs. Because after that mass march in Memphis, Tennessee, and after the workers went back to work, many of those leaders who stood up and stood out were fired. They were fired. Okay, so labor retaliation is an issue, and that needs to be addressed. Career advancement opportunities, pathways to professional development, improved working conditions, safety protocols, protect the health and well-being of workers, union representation will strengthen our economy. And advocate for the rights and interests of workers. addressing disparities and these determinants within these communities, focusing on reducing disparities faced by men and women in the United States and across Maryland. Community and policy support. We have to support one another. We have to support organizations. We have to vote. We have to vote, people. And we have to convince the sleeping giants to wake up and vote. Regardless of what's taking place, we still need to vote because we have less voting rights today than we had in 1968, okay? They are being eroded and eradicated. We need to wake up our communities and support the future for economic justice.
Thank you. I will kick that same question to President Courtney Jenkins.
Thank you. And first I'll say everything that my good brother Stewart said, support, please support. Those are priorities of the AFL-CIO as well. But on a broader scale, support the rights to organize. We must get the PRO Act, the people protecting the right to organize, reintroduced in this Congress, and we recognize it will be an uphill battle looking at the political landscape. But this makes it easier for workers to come together and form a union. It holds employees accountable for being bad actors. It makes sure that if there's retaliation that happens to employees, that there's a clear path to make sure that those things are addressed, right? So again, the PRO Act, the People Protecting the Right to Organize Act, it was introduced in the last congressional session, but as we all know, will have to be reintroduced again. But also supporting efforts to organize at the local level. I think it was Brother Robert Beasley from the movie that we watched that said, had it not been for the community, we wouldn't have made it. And that does matter, you know, because when you're a constituent and you're calling your local legislator to say, hey, support these workers and their rights to form a union and come together, they hear those things. They know the AFL is going to call, they know the respective organizations going to call, but when they hear their constituents calling, that does matter. And I'm going to share a link with just more information on how to form and join unions, but also if you're interested in coming together with your coworkers, that link will take you to the National AFL-CIO website. And what they do is they send it to our respective labor and state labor councils and state federations to make connections with you. But again, on a broad level, always support the calls to action that our unions put out, because again, they help manage and level the power dynamics in the workplace. And you know, what we do at the end of the day is we make sure that expectations of our workplaces become the reality. And that's what it's all about. So, Sister Rachel, I'm going to share that link with you, and feel free to share it with the broader chat.
Thank you, President Jenkins. And finally, Dr. Slayton, what would be your call for next steps for those of us who are here and just want to get engaged?
Because so many folks today were fearful of the inclement weather, a lot of them chose not to come to church today. So you get to get a piece of my sermon of the call to action. And it is rooted in Isaiah chapter 59, verses 14 through 16. And I'm paraphrasing, summarizing. Simply says, justice is turned back because truth stumbles in the street. Justice is turned back because truth stumbles in the street. I think that the greatest work that we need to do is to find a way to fight our way through complicit behaviors. To not be comfortable just sitting on the sideline. Yes, throw your support wholeheartedly to Fair Share Maryland and the work we're doing in Annapolis. Definitely reach out to your elected officials about issues that matter. But more importantly, those folks that are closest to us that we have access to, make a conscious decision to be deliberate and choose not to be complacent or complicit, because so much more is at stake. You have a voice, and it's time we all use them for the good of humanity.
Thank you. I want to ask one question that did show up by our audience, and I'm going to direct it to just Stewart and Courtney because it is a labor specific question. Are the extremely dangerous working conditions for many illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, including minors in the US, being addressed by labor organizations or other entities. How can the residential status of undocumented immigrants be protected? And even more so in this new administration. And additionally, this was an interesting connection. Approximately 10% of Maryland's workers are federal employees. And this incoming Trump administration has made federal employees their target, which really is connected to racism and has an anti-Semitic tinge as well, because federal workers are disproportionately Black or Jewish American. So if Dr. King was alive today, would he not be marching or supporting federal employees and undocumented workers as he did for Memphis employees? And what will the union movement do to help and protect these workers?
Courtney, you want to start? I'm happy to
Yeah,
chat.
sure. And that's a lot to unpack. But again,
Yeah.
actually our national AFL-CIO and 27 of our affiliated unions, a part of that federation, are currently working on and have stood up a rapid response action plan to protect workers on the front lines, our immigrant workers, our federal workforce included. And that includes organizations like AFSCME and SEIU and Unite Here, because we know there's something coming. And we've seen it in the 1.0 era of the person who shall remain nameless. But we're anticipating that there will be a lot of on the ground battles that we may face, ICE raids in workplaces. So what we're doing is encouraging and equipping our organizations and their memberships to be trained on the different rights that they have on and off the job, but also to be a show of force and solidarity for that anything that does come. If ICE does come to your workplace, what are the things that you can do if you're not directly impacted to protect your sister and brother who may be directly impacted? So those are conversations that are happening as we speak, and that will continue to happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would simply add our movement is prepared to stand in solidarity with unionized workers, but also ununionized workers. I know there was a national call the other night about this very issue from the AFL-CIO, and locally we've been partnering with Casa de Maryland. I know BHC has partnered with Casa de Maryland, and years ago I helped facilitate a training with Casa during the first Trump administration to protect undocumented people. I think there's going to be a series of really important questions we all have to ask ourselves and our organizations about how far we will go, and we should go, in my opinion, to protect people from racist, xenophobic, nativist raids on people in our community, whether they're workers, whether they're just parents or caregivers or children. I know our union has been, frankly, doing things right now to make sure that ICE isn't separating families, because we represent folks in social services. I know, we also represent folks in the Department of Corrections, so that we are only focusing on state, the rights and the responsibilities of the state, and not doing the work of the federal government. And I think there's a multitude more. We also have a surprisingly large immigrant population at AFSCME, Maryland. We have thousands of correctional officers who are African immigrants whose family could be impacted. And then we actually have a couple thousand members, mostly in the Prince George's County area and University of Maryland, who are primarily immigrants from South and Central America. So we've had groups talking about this, like member leaders talking about this and how to respond and how to make sure we are not collaborators to a regime that wants to do nothing but hurt people who are different.
That's right. Our time on this panel is up. I just want to thank every single one of you, Stuart, President Jenkins, Ms. Fall, Dr. Slayton. I would, folks who are participating on the Zoom, feel free to use those applause emojis, because this has been a really powerful conversation, and I think gave us some very concrete things to think about. So what I'm going to do right now is pass the mic on to Claire Landers, who's a longtime member of Jews United for Justice and the Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, to talk about our very specific call to action. So thank you all again.
Hi all, I'm Claire Landers, daughter of a lifelong, very committed union guy, a congregant of Baltimore Hebrew congregation, and a leader with Jews United for Justice, which I am proud to point out is an organization with a unionized staff. Thank you, Courtney Jenkins, Linnell Fall, Dr. Kevin Slayton, Stuart Katzenberg, and our panel moderator, Claudia Baylog, for bringing forward the challenges that economic justice advocates and union organizers face today, and for making us aware of the structural changes that still need to happen if we want to make Dr. King's famous dream of equality and justice in America any closer to reality in our own community. For me, as a white person and as a Jew, the most meaningful way to honor Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy is to be as fearless as he was in prevailing upon those who hold power to change the systems that still today reinforce injustice and inequality in Baltimore and Maryland. So I'd like to invite you all to take action with JUFJ in two key campaigns to address inequality at the local and state levels. The first campaign is called With Us, For Us. JUFJ is working in a broad coalition to advocate for more equitable payment in lieu of taxes agreement between Baltimore City and the city's largest tax-exempt universities and hospitals. That agreement is called the pilot. These huge institutions do not pay property tax. However, they do depend on and use city infrastructure and services. The pilot agreement creates a massive gap in the annual funding for the city and upkeep of those services that rely on ordinary city residents to fill the gap with taxes from their own pockets. As we know, city residents are already tax burdened. The 14 largest hospitals and universities in the city contribute $6 million annually towards city services, though those services cost the city $47 million. That $6 million contribution via the pilot agreement and limited by the pilot agreement represents only 1.57% of their own total operating income. These institutions need to pay their fair share in the functioning of Baltimore City. The pilot agreement will be renegotiated in 2026, and we want to ensure it is more equitable going forward. We'll be posting a commitment card online at the end of this program that you can fill in online to indicate ways in which you would like to help JUFJ win the With Us, For Us campaign with our coalition partners. The second campaign is called Fair Share for Maryland to address inequities baked into Maryland's tax system. So Maryland has an upside down tax system where the wealthiest residents and large corporations do not pay their fair share of taxes. In fact, 30% of large corporations in this state do not pay any taxes at all in Maryland. And also this year, the state is facing a $2.7 billion deficit. There will surely be drastic cuts to education, transit, and other critical services and infrastructure proposed if we do not pass progressive taxation reform. JUFJ is working with the Fair Share for Maryland Coalition to advance a substantive progressive taxation proposal. We've received some hopeful news that Governor Moore has included some of the Fair Share Plan provisions into his budget proposal that he released this past week. But the legislature's House and Senate will be putting together their own budget proposals. JUFJ has a statewide economic justice working group that is advocating for the Fair Share Plan, and for the positive components of the governor's budget, and we welcome all the folks here to join us. On your online commitment card, you will have a chance to sign up for the next working group meeting, and we meet via Zoom. And we also encourage you to write testimony for this bill. One-page written testimony is one of the most impactful actions you can personally take during the legislative session, which goes through the first week of April. JUFJ can teach you how to do that. Please check off that box on the commitment card. So I send it back to Rachel Cutler to get that card up there and get people signing up to help.
So we're going to play some exit music and we're going to drop the commitment card again, although Lily already dropped it before. And take a moment because we want to hear your feedback on this event. We want to hear if you're interested in joining these important campaigns. Thank you, Claire, for that very powerful call to action. So again, we're going to pop up a slide with some upcoming events. Please take a moment to fill out the commitment card. And Andy, is there anything else you want to say before we did that?
I just want to thank our panel. And can you hear me? I don't think I can be heard, so let's not bother.
Walking and talking with my mind. Set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Walk, 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 you gotta talk, talk, 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 you gotta talk, 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 cause it ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep it set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep your mind, Lord. Set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep your mind. Set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
I'll just say in conclusion, for those who are still with us, we want to really thank our panel for bringing the lessons of what we learned from this very important film forward, and to bring that message that we all need to learn from. So wonderful job from the panel. Claudia, you did a terrific job as well, and Claire as well. We're very grateful for everybody's participation, but most importantly, we're looking forward to as many people as possible helping to do the work that needs to be done. So thanks also to the audience for attending.
we'll play maybe one more closeout song as folks are filling out their commitment card. Thank you again for being here.
You know that you can have permanent teeth in just 24 hours. That's right. Only 24 hours. When the man Lord set on freedom, and woke up this morning when the man set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. I'm walking and talking with the man set on freedom. I'm walking and talking with the man, Lord, set on freedom. I'm walking and talking with the man, set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Walk, 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 you gotta talk, talk, 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 cause it ain't no harm to keep your mind set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep the man, Lord, set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep the man set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
All right, folks. Well, we're going to send out the links that were shared in the chat with everybody following the meeting. We'll also share the commitment card because we want to hear from you. But otherwise, we're going to officially close the event today. So thank you all for being here. Have a great evening.
Thanks for moderating us, Rachel, and keeping us together.
There were
This-
many people behind the scenes doing that, but thank you.
No, but we were all chatting to you and sending you the questions. So
Yes,
thank
thanks.
you again.
And for your ability to pivot for inclement weather, that's awesome.
Yes, it is starting to snow where I'm at, so I am glad we pivoted.
You're right.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, Claude. You
Bye-bye.
too. Have a good evening.
Go Ravens!
That's right.
Save the chat. Save the chat.
Yes, thank you. We will save the chat. Great call.
And-
There's three
and-
dots in the top
right.
right.
And
In the
each
top.
person now can, you have the settings so that everyone can save the chat themselves too. That's great.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Organizers are going to stay on for a few minutes, so we're sticking here, but thank you all. I'm going to start kicking folks out unless you have any specific questions. Did we stop the recording? I don't see it going still.
It's still